Shalom. My name is Ron Elkin. I'm the director of Ami Ministry in the Philadelphia area. Ami is a Hebrew word. It means my people, from Isaiah 40 verse 1, where God says, comfort, comfort my people. As an organization, we cannot think of any greater comfort to anyone, whether they're Jewish or Gentile, than to come into a relationship with the living God who created the heavens and the earth. And so our organization's hope and prayers are that people will look at the evidence in the Jewish scriptures to see and how these prophecies there in the scriptures portray who the Messiah is. And looking at all the preponderance of evidence, it becomes clear that Jesus really is the promised Messiah. Now, this is part 2 of a video series called the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I urge you to look at part 1 if you haven't. We're attempting to answer some of the myths and lies and questions that have been raised about modern Israel. One of the myths is that did the Jews steal the land? Are they European colonialists who came into the land after being away for thousands of years and uprooted the population that lived there, the Palestinian people? Who are the Palestinian people? Are they actually an ethnic group? Are they a tribal group? Where did they come from? And so these videos are an attempt to answer these questions. We ended the last video talking about the Muslim rule starting in the 6th century AD, and how at first the Jews were treated fairly. They did have to pay a tax as non-Muslims, but they were allowed to have their religious observances. They were allowed to own property. Their property rights were protected. They were well integrated into society. They had a good standing there, except they did have to pay a tax as non-Muslims. Starting around the 8th century, there began to be much more oppression against the Jewish people. The taxes increased. They began to be restricted in their religious practices, and life became more and more difficult for them, so that the population of Jewish people began to decrease under this heavy oppression. By the end of the 10th century, this population of Jewish people was still sizable, even in spite of this, and there was like 300,000 Jewish people living in the area. Now, under the Crusaders, which began in 1099 AD at the urging of Pope Urban II, the Crusaders invaded the land. They took over the Jerusalem and other areas, and they slaughtered non-Christian residents. For example, they gathered the Jewish people in Jerusalem after they captured the city. They gathered them into the large synagogue, and they set it on fire, and they marched around the synagogue singing Christian hymns as the Jewish people were killed by the fire. It's pretty horrible. It's hard to believe that Christians would do that, but through false doctrine and through false teaching, and also many of these people were Christian in cultural name only, not in reality. They felt that it was justified to do these horrible deeds. Well, anyway, they were defeated eventually by Saladin, and he invited the Jewish people to come back into the area. Now, I want you to understand there always was a presence of Jewish people, even during the Crusader period. They were up in the northern part of the country, up in Safed and in other areas, and Tiberias. But the bulk of the population was either killed or they fled from the Crusaders. When Saladin came in, he encouraged the Jews to move back into the area, and they particularly began to settle in the northern coastal city of Acre, and which nearby there was a port there at that point. And so the Jews settled in that area, and then when Saladin eventually was his reign was taken over by a Muslim military class of people from Egypt called the Mumlaks, they became paranoid about the Crusaders invading the country again, and they destroyed the ports. And this caused the area to become very desolate. It further reduced the population of Jewish people, but also the area became economically a wasteland. It became a backward province ruled from Damascus, and many absentee landlords and Then the Ottoman Empire took over from 1517 to 1917. Now, the Ottomans they adopted a tolerant attitude towards the Jewish people, leading to many Jewish people returning to the land, particularly when Spain expelled the Jewish population. Um, Jewish people moved throughout Palestine, but particularly the four holy cities of Judaism, which are Jerusalem, uh, Hebron, Tiberias, and Safed. At one point, Safed developed a population of 10,000 Jewish people, and it became the center of Jewish mysticism. This is an area where the Kabbalah was expanded and written about. It still is to this day a significant center for Jewish mysticism. Eventually the Ottomans began to impose heavy oppressive taxes on the residents of Palestine. And so many of the Jewish people left by the end of the 17th century. Um, by the end of the 18th century, much of the land in Palestine was owned by wealthy absentee landlords who were living in Damascus, Beirut, and Cairo. What they did is they leased the land out to farmers who were imposed with heavy taxes, and the farmers worked the land, but they were kept in poverty because of the heavy taxes. Then somebody in the Ottoman Empire had the bright idea of imposing a tree tax. They told the people, for every tree on your property, we're going to charge you a tax. They never dreamed that the people, in order to avoid the taxes, would cut the trees down. And that's exactly what they did. In the northern areas, the trees had absorbed the rainwater and the water that comes down from the mountains. And so what happened is it became a swampy area, a malaria-ridden swampy area. In the south, the hills were denuded of trees, and it became more of a desert area. So thanks to this tree tax, the land was further desolated. When a Spanish traveler went there, he recorded his travels, he found that Jerusalem had become a city of abject poverty populated by only a small number of Jewish people. And so what was once a vital Jewish community had shrunk drastically because of this horrible denuding of the trees in Palestine. In the 19th century, European people and American also began to rediscover Palestine, particularly setting up schools of archaeology. They were very interested in biblical studies, and there began to be a rebuilding of the ports, and so that began to prosper the area a little bit more. Postal and telegraph services were established, and so by 1856, there were 17,000 Jewish people in the land, and in Jerusalem there was a majority Jewish population. And so it seems throughout history, after 300 AD, as I said in the first section, if you haven't seen it, I urge you to look at it, there has been a continuous presence of Jewish people in the Jerusalem area. There was a continuous presence even after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD up in the northern area of Israel. When Mark Twain visited the area, he wrote that about the Jezreel Valley, which is the northern part of Israel. And he wrote it in Innocents Abroad. There's not a solitary village throughout its whole extent. You can go for 30 miles in either direction and not see a person. There are 2 or 3 clusters of Bedouin tents, but not a single permanent habitation. He also wrote, one may ride 10 miles and not see a human being. Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. That's how Mark Twain described it when he traveled there. And he wrote that in his book of Journal of Travels and called Innocents Abroad. He said that over it brood the spell of a curse that has withered its field. Nazareth is forlorn, Jerusalem has lost all its grandeur, and now is a pauper village. So it was not an abundant place by any stretch of the imagination. According to Joan Peters, who wrote a book called From Time Immortal, published in 1984. Among the peoples who have been counted as indigenous Arabs living in Palestine, this is according to the encyclopedias that were written and also early parts of the 20th century records. The Arabs, according to her, and according to encyclopedias that were written at that point, the Arabs called themselves South Syrian Arabs. They wanted to be attached to Syria. They did not identify clearly as a Palestinian people until the 1960s, and particularly after 1967, and I'll talk about more of this later. But in addition to the migrant, it was a migrant population that came in and out of the area. In addition to the Muslims or the Arab-speaking people, there were Latins, Egyptians who also spoke Arabic, Turks, Armenians, Italians, Persians, Kurds, Germans, Afghans, Bosnians, Sudanese, and 7 more ethnic groups. The Encyclopedia Britannica, the 1911 edition, states that there are widely different groups of inhabitants with no less than 50 languages being spoken in the area. For this reason, the encyclopedia stated it's no easy task to write concisely on the ethnology of Palestine. In other words, there was no clear Palestinian people who go back centuries and centuries who identify themselves as a unique ethnic group called Palestinians. In an official British document about the area's population written in the 1920s, it's again, you can find this from Time Immortal by Peters, came to the conclusion that the people living west of the Jordan River are not Arabs, but only Arab-speaking, and are of mixed races. So this nullifies the present assertion by the Palestinians, who, by the way, God does love and does care about. Don't misunderstand anything I'm saying here that I'm down on Palestinians as a people. God loves. God is no respecter of any person. God wants people to understand the gospel and to believe in Jesus, but at the same time, we're all in the same boat. We're all equally sinners that need to be forgiven and reconciled with God. And God does love the people who now call themselves Palestinians, or let's say Arabs who are living in what was called by the Romans Palestine. So the idea that they were an indigenous people group is not at all accurate. Another feature of the 19th century was that a large portion of the Muslim population was migratory. The population consisted of migrants and peasants who were born in other lands, and they could be exploited by oppressive landowners or corrupt Turkish government officials. And the Muslims in turn would prey on the oppressed Jewish population. The Palestinian Authority fantasizes that today's Palestinians are offspring of invaders and immigrants seeking economic opportunity. That they're descended from a tribe of ancient Canaan and the Jebusites. In fact, they're overwhelmingly offsprings of invaders and migrants seeking economic opportunities. By the end of the 19th century, Palestine had not had its own government since the fall of the Jewish Commonwealth in 73 or 70, between 70 and 73 AD. Well, the conclusion of this historical information, starting in part 1, is that there is no distinct people group called Palestinians until relatively recent history. There were no writings, flag, national fervor, nor self-identity of a distinct and significant national population called Palestinians until the late 20th century, whereas the Jewish people have a traceable linkage to the land for the past 3,500 years.